The coffee grew cold in front of him, just like it did every Friday night. Mark Davidson sat in the same booth, ordered the same meal, and left an empty chair across from him. For 2 years, he hadn't missed a single week. The staff at Rosie's Diner knew not to ask questions, but Catherine Chen, the newly appointed CEO of Horizon Innovations who had recently moved to town, couldn't help but wonder about the man with sad eyes who seemed to be waiting for someone who never came. Before I continue this heartbreaking journey, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that remind us of the power of human connection. Your support means everything, and I promise this story will touch your heart in ways you never expected. Mark's routine began at exactly 6:30 p.m. every Friday. He'd walk through the diner's doors dressed in a faded blue button-down shirt that had seen better days, his hair carefully combed but his shoulders heavy with invisible weight. The waitresses would exchange knowing glances as he slid into booth 7 by the window, ordered a burger with fries, and requested that a chocolate milkshake be placed across from him. "Table for 2, he'd always say, even though he'd been sitting alone for years. Catherine had noticed him 3 weeks in a row now. Her company had relocated her to this small town to oversee their new manufacturing plant, and she'd found Rosie's Diner by chance, drawn to its retro charm and home-style cooking. The Friday night special, meatloaf that reminded her of her grandmother's recipe, had quickly become her end-of-week reward after long days of corporate meetings and decision-making. "Who's that man?" she finally asked her waitress, Doris, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude who had served at Rosie's for over 30 years. Doris's expression softened. "That's Mark. Don't mind him. He's harmless, just stuck in the past, I suppose." Catherine nodded, but her curiosity only grew. In her world of spreadsheets and strategic planning, direct questions yielded direct answers. After finishing her meal, she did something completely out of character. She approached a stranger. "Excuse me," she said, standing beside his booth. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I couldn't help noticing you've been sitting alone here several weeks in a row." Mark looked up, startled by the intrusion into his ritual. His eyes, a deep brown that might once have sparkled with life, now carried the dull sheen of prolonged grief. "I'm not alone," he said softly, gesturing to the untouched milkshake. "I'm waiting for my daughter." Catherine's heart sank. The milkshake had barely begun to melt, suggesting it had been served recently, but something in his voice told her this wasn't a simple case of a late arrival. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the empty seat. Mark hesitated, then nodded. For 2 years, no one had sat in Emma's seat. No one had dared. "My name is Catherine," she offered, extending her hand across the table. "Mark," he replied, his handshake firm but brief. "Mark Davidson." "Your daughter," Catherine began carefully, "is she running late?" Mark's gaze drifted to the window, to the darkening sky beyond. "She's always late. Or maybe I'm too early. It's hard to know anymore." The conversation might have ended there, a brief, awkward exchange between strangers, if not for the photograph Mark had placed beside the milkshake. Catherine's eyes fell on the image of a smiling teenage girl with her father's eyes and a bright yellow headband holding back curly brown hair. "That's Emma," Mark said, noticing Catherine's gaze. She would be 17 now. The word "would" hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "She's beautiful," Catherine said truthfully. "She was," Mark corrected, and the past tense broke something open between them. 2 years ago, Emma was diagnosed with leukemia. Friday nights were our special time, burger night, we called it. Even during treatment, we never missed it. She'd sit right there, drinking her chocolate milkshake, telling me about her week at school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a marine biologist. Catherine remained silent, understanding now why the staff left Mark to his ritual. "The last time we came here together, she was so weak she could barely hold her straw. But she insisted. She made me promise that no matter what happened, I'd keep coming." She said, his voice caught, she said that as long as I kept her seat warm, a part of her would still be here with me. Mark hadn't told anyone this story since Emma's passing. Not his co-workers at the construction company where he worked as a foreman. Not his few remaining friends who had drifted away as grief consumed him. Not even his own parents, who had suggested more than once that his Friday ritual wasn't healthy. So I come, he continued, every Friday at 6:30. I order her favorite meal, and I tell her about my week. It probably seems crazy to you. Catherine shook her head, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. It doesn't seem crazy at all. It seems like love. For the first time in their brief acquaintance, Mark truly looked at Catherine. She wasn't what he expected from someone dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. There was a gentleness to her, a humanity that her corporate title couldn't diminish. "What about you?" he asked. "You're new in town." Catherine smiled, surprised by his observation. "Is it that obvious?" "Small town," Mark replied with a slight shrug. "New faces stand out." "I moved here 3 weeks ago to oversee the New Horizon plant," she explained. "I'm still getting used to the pace. In New York, I rarely saw the same faces twice at my local coffee shop. Here, Doris already knows my order and that I prefer extra gravy on my meatloaf." Mark nodded. "That's Millfield for you. Not much happens here, but the people look out for each other. At least, that's how it used to be." "Used to be?" Mark's expression darkened slightly. After Emma got sick, people didn't know what to say. They meant well, but eventually, most stopped trying. It's easier to avoid someone's pain than to witness it, I guess. Catherine understood that isolation all too well, though from a different perspective. As a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder through determination and sacrifice, she had created her own kind of solitude. Her recent divorce had only reinforced the walls she'd built around herself. "I know something about being alone in a crowded room," she admitted. Their conversation continued, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Mark told Catherine about Emma's love for the ocean, how she'd never seen it in person but kept a collection of seashells sent by pen pals from coastal schools. Catherine shared stories of her own childhood dreams of becoming an architect before the practical pull of business school redirected her path. As the diner began to empty, Doris approached their table with gentle reluctance. "We're closing up in 10 minutes, folks." Mark looked at his watch, surprised to find it was nearly 10 p.m. He had never stayed this late before, always leaving at precisely 8 o'clock, when Emma's treatment schedule had required them to return home. "I should go," he said, reaching for his wallet. "Let me," Catherine offered, but Mark shook his head. "This is Emma's dinner. I always pay." Catherine respected the boundary. As they walked to the parking lot, the night air carried the first hint of autumn coolness. They stood awkwardly by their vehicles, his weathered pickup truck a stark contrast to her least luxury sedan. "Thank you," Mark said simply. "For asking. Most people just stare and whisper." "Thank you for answering," Catherine replied. She hesitated, then added, "Would it be inappropriate if I joined you again sometime? Not in Emma's seat, of course, but maybe at your table?" The question surprised them both. Catherine Chen, who scheduled her life in 15-minute increments and had cancelled her own birthday dinner last year to finalize a merger, was asking to share a meal with a stranger who talked to an empty chair. Mark considered her request. "Next Friday," he finally offered. "Around 7:30? After Emma and I have had some time together?" Catherine nodded. "I'd like that." As she drove back to her sparsely furnished rental home that night, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. Perhaps it was simply the unexpected connection with another human being after months of lonely hotel rooms and corporate apartments. Or perhaps it was the reminder that behind every person was a story far more complex than surface appearances suggested. For Mark, that night marked the first time he had spoken Emma's name without feeling the familiar vice grip of pain around his heart. He still ached for his daughter, still missed her with an intensity that sometimes made it difficult to breathe. But sharing her memory with someone who listened without judgment had lightened the burden, if only temporarily. The following Friday, Mark sat with Emma as usual. He told her about his week, about the new housing development his crew had started, about the cardinal that had built a nest in the maple tree outside their kitchen window. Then, at 7:25, he carefully moved her milkshake to the side, making space while preserving her presence. Catherine arrived 5 minutes later, carrying a small paper bag that she placed on the table between them. "I hope you don't mind," she said, opening the bag to reveal a small potted coral cactus with a tiny pink flower blooming at its center. "I was at the garden center getting some plants for my new place, and this reminded me of what you said about Emma loving the ocean. The woman there told me these are called coral cacti because they look like sea coral." Mark touched the small plant gently, his fingertips brushing against the textured surface. It was such a small gesture, but it indicated something profound. Catherine had listened to his words and carried them with her into the world. "She would have loved this," he said softly. "Thank you." Their Friday meetings continued through the autumn months and into winter. Catherine learned that Mark had raised Emma alone since she was 5, after her mother decided that motherhood and small-town life weren't compatible with her dreams of becoming a professional dancer. Mark discovered that Catherine's driven exterior concealed a woman who had sacrificed personal connections for professional advancement, only to question those choices after her ex-husband left her for someone less intimidating. Neither intended for friendship to develop, much less anything deeper, but connection has its own timeline, independent of human planning. By Christmas, Catherine had become a regular fixture at Booth 7. The staff at Rosie's no longer looked surprised to see the corporate executive sitting with the construction foreman. Doris had even begun setting 3 places, one for Mark, one for Catherine, and one for Emma, whose milkshake remained a constant presence. On the Friday before Christmas, Catherine arrived to find Mark looking more troubled than usual. The holiday season was difficult for him. Last year, he had barely left his house between Christmas Eve and New Year's Day. "Everything okay?" she asked as she slid into her seat across from Emma's milkshake. Mark sighed. "The hospital called. They're doing their annual holiday fundraiser for the pediatric oncology ward, and they want me to speak at the event. About Emma. About our experience." Catherine understood his hesitation immediately. "That would be difficult. I've never spoken publicly about her illness." "Not to a room full of strangers," Mark admitted. "But the doctor who treated her, Dr. Patel," she asked personally. "Said my story might help other families feel less alone." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture Catherine had come to recognize. "I don't know if I can do it. I can barely talk about Emma without." He stopped, embarrassed by the emotion threatening to overtake him. Without feeling everything all over again, Catherine finished for him. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "You don't have to decide right now. And whatever you choose, it's the right decision." Mark turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "Would you, if I did decide to speak, would you come with me?" The vulnerability in his question touched Catherine deeply. In her previous life, she had attended countless charity galas and fundraisers, always networking, always with an agenda. The thought of attending simply to support someone else, to be present without ulterior motive, was novel and surprisingly appealing. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "I'll be there." The hospital fundraiser was held in the grand ballroom of Millfield's only luxury hotel. Catherine helped Mark prepare his speech, sitting at his kitchen table as he struggled to find words worthy of Emma's memory. The night of the event, she drove them both, sensing that Mark needed to conserve his emotional energy. He wore his only suit, purchased years ago for a cousin's wedding and slightly too tight across the shoulders now. Catherine had offered to buy him a new one, but Mark had declined, unwilling to cross that boundary. Instead, she had brought over her sewing kit and taken in the jacket slightly, her fingers remembering skills learned from her grandmother long before spreadsheets and profit margins dominated her life. When Mark took the podium, his hands trembled visibly. He looked out at the sea of faces, doctors, nurses, community leaders, wealthy donors, and for a moment, Catherine feared he might turn and leave. Then his eyes found hers in the crowd, and something steadied within him. "My daughter Emma loved the ocean," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "She never got to see it in person, but she believed that she would someday. Even when the doctors told us her prognosis was poor, she kept planning her future trips to coral reefs and tide pools. She refused to stop dreaming." The room grew quiet as Mark shared Emma's story, not just her illness and death, but her life. Her laugh that came from deep in her belly. Her collection of odd-shaped rocks that she insisted had magical properties. The way she would save her allowance to buy small gifts for other children in the oncology ward. "What I learned from my 15-year-old daughter," Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion, "is that time isn't measured in years but in moments. Emma packed more living into her short life than many people do in decades. She taught me that grief is just love with nowhere to go. So every Friday night, I give that love somewhere to go. I keep our tradition alive because somewhere, somehow, I believe she knows." By the time he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the ballroom. Dr. Patel announced that the evening had raised enough money to create a new marine biology corner in the pediatric ward, complete with aquariums and educational materials. They would name it Emma's Ocean. As Mark and Catherine drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield, a gentle snow began to fall, dusting the world in white silence. "Thank you," Mark said, watching the snowflakes dance in the headlights. "I couldn't have done that without you." Catherine kept her eyes on the road, but her right hand found his across the console. "You did it for Emma. I just stood beside you." "No one has stood beside me since she died," Mark admitted. "I didn't let them." When they reached his modest home, Catherine expected to say goodnight and drive to her own place across town. Instead, Mark invited her in for coffee, and they ended up talking until dawn, watching the snow accumulate in his backyard, creating a pristine blanket over Emma's garden, which had lain dormant since her passing. "I should plant something there in spring," Mark mused, looking out at the snow-covered beds. "Emma would hate seeing it empty." "She would," Catherine agreed, imagining the vibrant colors that could replace the current emptiness. "Maybe sunflowers?" "You said they were her favorite." "And coral cacti," Mark added with a small smile. "She would definitely want those now." As winter thawed into spring, Mark and Catherine's relationship deepened beyond friendship. Their Friday dinners at Rosie's remained sacred, Emma's milkshake still occupied its place of honor, but they added other traditions. Sunday morning hikes in the state park. Wednesday night cooking experiments in Catherine's kitchen, which gradually filled with personal touches as she committed to making Millfield her home rather than just a career stop. At work, Catherine's employees noticed a change in their CEO. The sharp-edged executive who had arrived in town with a reputation for demanding excellence at all costs had softened somehow, though her business acumen remained as keen as ever. She implemented family-friendly policies at the plant, established a scholarship fund for local students interested in STEM fields, and became a regular volunteer at the Children's Hospital where Emma had spent so much of her final year. For his part, Mark began to emerge from the cocoon of grief that had enveloped him. He started coaching Little League again, something he had abandoned after Emma's diagnosis. He accepted a promotion to project manager at the construction company, a position he had previously turned down because it would have meant more responsibility when all his energy was focused on being Emma's father. Life was changing for them both, but Friday nights remained constant. Until the anniversary of Emma's passing approached, and Mark grew distant. "I can't do it this Friday," he told Catherine during a tense phone call 3 days before. "I can't sit in that booth and pretend everything is normal." "Mark, nothing about your Friday ritual has ever been normal," Catherine replied.